instead of leading with the takeaways from this rule, as we did that in part 1, I'd like to take this little time to issue a couple corrections. First, you can buy Maps of Meaning from Amazon. I don't know how I missed it, but I did. I think maybe I saw the audiobook as the thing, and it's like, I hate audiobooks for this sort of thing, so I ignored it, didn't click on it and see that that's where you go buy the paperback. So keep the whole rant about academic books being really hard to find, because in general they are, but Maps of Meaning did get mass publication. So, 2, a little bit more severe, I learned something about Wikipedia and how to use the track revision changes tool there. I swear I checked it and got the impression that the Wikipedia wasn't in that state since like 2017 in that part, but as one commenter pointed out, nope. If anything, the Wikipedia article probably just copied this book. So I was wrong. Peterson does apparently know better, at least in this instance, and he may have many problems with source handling and referencing, but this is not one of them. So thankfully, that's not the case in this. He didn't plagiarize, and I just wanted to make that clear. So now that I am thoroughly embarrassed and feel like I have no credibility left, let's move on to the video. Welcome back to the channel. We are on week 4 of Dr. Caceres' descent into style madness. Like I said, next week will be something not Peterson, but this week we are finishing off Rule 2 of Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, which is treat yourself like someone you would be responsible for helping. I keep paraphrasing it every single time. I think that's it. So, before we get into part 2, let's recap part 1. First, not fully resolved, is this idea that people will take care of themselves worse than they will their pets or somebody they're responsible for because of some type of shame. We will get back to that in this video, so yay! Second, something else that's not fully resolved is this idea that we needed to understand some basic assumptions about the ancient world in order to understand Genesis, and we don't really come back to that explicitly in this video. I think maybe the assumptions are just that reality was construed differently in the olden times than it is now with our science and materialism and all that, but I'm just shooting darts at a board here. Third is this idea that there are 3 basic elements to subjective experience, and they are order, chaos, and consciousness, which mediates between the two. And that idea doesn't come up again. Fourth is that we are evolutionarily adapted to dealing with personalities, thinking about things in terms of their personalities and stuff. And this can be for actual people with personalities or for not people and non-living objects like rocks and stuff. And Peterson says that order and chaos are personalities with masculine and feminine overlays. Fifth is the idea that our deepest and most meaningful category is between female and male, so biological sex, and that this divides everything that we possibly think of into those categories. Sixth is that women as nature, or nature as women, are selective breeders and frequently hurt men's feelings, but this selection that women do is what made us into the world-changing creatures that we are today. Seventh is that knowledge of this sex dichotomy that's so deeply rooted in our consciousness and our cognitive processing of stuff and our perception, knowledge of this dichotomy is the Christian or Taoist way. Finally, you need to have some order and chaos in your life in order to grow as a person, and this deviates from Rule 1, which was much more about living in order and kind of keeping chaos over there in the forest, away from you. Before getting into the actual video, if this is your first video of this series, there's a stylistic cueing as for what's going on. So this coloring and everything, we are talking about Peterson, what he's saying, direct interpretations of the book, and then I forgot to record the other setups with this, so here's some still images. Yay! So this setup with this type of Pikachu means I'm giving my interpretation of what he's saying or my take on it, my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences. And then this other lighting setup with the safety lab glass Pikachu means I'm talking about some scientific experiment or findings or other things. Okay, so let's actually kick off part 2 of Rule 2 by getting back into Genesis. Peterson revisits the writing of Genesis specifically, but also the Bible, mentioning that it wasn't just one author the entire way through writing it, but that Genesis 1 probably had a different author than Genesis 2 through the rest, and also brings up somebody who I guess is referred to as the redactor, who really worked to make them fit together and just kind of cut some stuff out. So Genesis 1, according to Peterson, is about God the Creator going about making order out of the primordial chaos with the power of the Word. God created light and said it was good, that stuff. And then Genesis 2 and on is about God making stuff, but then the goings-on in the garden and sort of the rest of the story after creating stuff. A lot of this video is going to be Peterson basically retelling the Adam and Eve story from the Bible, but we're starting with Adam and Eve's creation in the Garden of Eden. There's a footnote on Eve's creation that's giving me chemistry flashbacks, and that's not a good thing. So I had a chemistry professor who, I think it was even the first day of class, was talking about natural logs and the log base 10 stuff, and so obviously log of this is whatever, and obviously then a log of this is whatever, and blah 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 blah. It was obvious to him, it was obvious to some of the smarties in the class, but not to this dum-dum. So basically, after a couple weeks of obviously blah and obviously blah, I gave up. I'd read the book and I came to class because he gave pop quizzes, but I just started sleeping through his class. I slept on the ground because he would single out and yell at students who were sleeping in his class that he saw, but the room was a nice auditorium room, so I just slept on the ground because it wasn't obvious to this idiot what he was talking about. Or, in another interpretation, he split the original androgynous individual into 2 parts, male and female. According to this line of thinking, Christ, the second Adam, is also the original man before the sexual subdivision. The symbolic meaning of this should be clear to those who have followed the argument thus far. Nope. Guess I'm not following the argument. Spell it out for the dumbs, Peterson. Don't be vague and don't assume. Maybe this is just about biological sex being the deepest category we have? Maybe? I don't know. It's the best I can do. Peterson highlights that Adam and Eve, when they were created, weren't self-conscious about their nakedness, and maybe even not conscious on a higher level. And he says that because they weren't self-conscious about their nakedness, and it's a point that the Bible authors highlight that they were unashamed or whatever, this means that the default for people is to be ashamed at being naked. He goes on to say that the only people around now who would be unashamed if suddenly dropped naked into a public place, excepting the odd exhibitionist, are those younger than 3 years of age. I haven't been mentioning the little drawings that accompany the start of each chapter because it hasn't really been relevant. However, all this talk of nakedness and shame is a little funny and maybe a little undone by his choice of the next art piece for the next rule, which is a depiction of Michelangelo's David, which is a very naked guy who is very much not ashamed of his nudity. We'll come back to this in the next section, so just stick a mental pin in this for now. Satisfied for now with talking about naked people, now we move on to the talking snake that shows up in the garden in Genesis 3. Yes, this is Yoshi. I don't have a snake. And yeah, he's got legs and he kind of talks. And the snake isn't always a bad guy, so he's our stand-in. So Peterson describes puzzling over why God would let a snake into Eden in the first place. And he said he finally settled on this idea that Eden represents perfect order and chaos is represented by the snake intruding into this garden. From a storytelling perspective, a creation myth explaining why our lives are like the way they are, with all toil and suffering and everything, that starts off with us in a place of paradise, needs to have something go wrong in order for us to be where we are now. Because otherwise we'd still be all hunky-dory up in Garden of Eden. God only knows why he allowed or placed such a creature in the garden. I have long puzzled over the meaning of this. It seems to be a reflection, in part, of the order-chaos dichotomy characterizing all of experience, with paradise serving as habitable order and the serpent playing the role of chaos. It just does not appear possible, even for God himself, to make a bounded space completely protected from the outside. The outside, chaos, always sneaks into the inside, because nothing can be completely walled off from the rest of reality. So even the ultimate in safe spaces inevitably harbors a snake. It hasn't been my style on this channel to really go after theological arguments, but I'm going to give it a go here. So either God is omnipotent, and so planned for the snake to come in, tempt Eve, have Eve eat the no-no apple, and for humanity to be cast out from paradise, or God isn't omnipotent. And so Peterson's musings about this kind of struck me as odd, because it's basically ended with a sort of shrug and chaos gonna chaos. And then to bring it back to evolutionary psychology, Peterson says that even if there aren't snakes for us to contend with, then snakes would take the form of our enemies, like people. The enemy, tribes, or countries, or whatever, those are the snakes. Apparently, even if we manage to get rid of all the literal and figurative snakes, sorry Yosh, then we're still not safe because the real chaos snake was inside us all along. Peterson says that Milton, in writing Paradise Lost, was brilliant for associating Satan with that talking snake. If you're not familiar, that's kind of the first place we see this idea that the talking snake was Satan in the garden and not just a snake up to no good. The worst of all possible snakes is the eternal human proclivity for evil. The worst of all possible snakes is psychological, spiritual, personal, internal. No walls, however tall, will keep that out.
None of you seem to understand. I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me!
Then Peterson starts swinging at parents he deems as overprotective of their children. So, extreme example, but if a parent basically kidnaps their child, locks them in the basement, no TV, no internet, no books, nothing, and basically has them completely isolated from the outside world. The too cautious, too caring parent merely substitutes him or herself for the other terrible problems of life. This is the great Freudian Oedipal nightmare. It is far better to render beings in your care competent than to protect them. Reference 49 is a documentary about the artist Robert Crumb. If that name doesn't ring a bell, I would say Google it somewhere private and not at work. That type of artist. I'm not sure why a documentary about him supports a Freudian Oedipal nightmare, but I'm not a psychoanalyst or an analyst, so... Then he says that, even if it's possible to have a perfectly safe, contained environment, then the kids will end up useless and infantile. And he goes on to speculate that maybe God added the snake in order to keep us sharp and attentive and not useless. Wasn't I saying something about this in Rule 1, about needing order and chaos in your life in order to keep you sharp? So, disclosure, I'm reading the chapters as I come to them. Like, I read it on Friday, shoot on Monday, have it up by the next Friday. So I really don't know if this is something that he'll waffle on, but the difference between Rule 1 and Rule 2 here are striking. Also, bringing this back to the woman is nature is woman whatever bullshit, wouldn't being rejected by a woman be a good thing? Like, it might cause the guy to go reflect about why he got rejected, maybe engage in some growth? Peterson doesn't make the connection here. He even asks parents, do you want to make your child safe or strong? Bit of a false dichotomy here. Making a child strong doesn't mean that they have to go be participants in Jackass. Finally, we move on to actually talking about Adam, Eve, and the talking snake. And the snake going and talking to Eve is no coincidence to Peterson. No shit, Sherlock, it's a story. The authors can write whatever they want to write, especially if it's reinforcing cultural norms. Perhaps primordial Eve had more reason to attend to serpents than Adam. Maybe they were more likely, for example, to prey on her tree-dwelling infants. Perhaps it is for this reason that Eve's daughters are more protective, self-conscious, fearful, and nervous to this day, even and especially in the most egalitarian of modern human societies. Here we go. Remember back in Rule 1, I warned about evolutionary psychology potentially becoming just so stories? This is a just so story of snakes and women and tree-dwelling babies. It can become not this by doing experiments on people, looking at if snakes are particularly more salient than other types of things, or working with animal models like primates and seeing their reactions to snakes and things. But as it stands, this is just speculation from Peterson. Reference 51 is an interesting paper, actually. I was a little afraid going into it, but it's actually pretty good. The researchers behind this basically own or are in control of this one particular personality test, and it's kind of an industry standard. And so part of the requirements for people around the world in using this test is that they have to submit their data to the people who control the test. And so these researchers had all of this data at their fingertips, and they went digging. And so they described finding: women tend to be higher in negative affect, submissiveness, and nurturance, and more concerned with feelings than with ideas. However, something to keep in mind whenever we're talking about differences between groups, gender differences, differences between SES groups, race, all of these different groups that we can compare between, there's something that is absolutely important to keep in mind. As described in this paper, gender differences, although pervasive, appear to be relatively subtle compared with the range of individual differences found within each gender. If you're not familiar with statistics, what does that mean? So I'm going to make a plot here of, let's say, negative affect. And so what the statement is saying is that, yes, on average, women have a higher negative affect rating than men. However, the individual differences this is talking about is that there is a huge amount of variability between women on this negative affect and men on this negative affect. It's just they have such a huge sample size here. A small difference is reliable, but may not be that meaningful in the grand scheme of things. Why this might be not that meaningful is that you have a whole chunk of men who are higher on negative affect than a whole chunk of women. And you have a whole chunk of women that are more negative on negative affect than men. So, yes, you have this difference between the groups that is statistically significant, but grand scheme of things, it's hard to say how meaningful this difference is. The authors also highlight in the abstract, so not even deep in the paper itself, that some of the differences that they found could possibly be explained by traditional gender roles in the different cultures. And this lines up with something that Natalie Wynn keeps emphasizing in her videos on gender. That gender, as we experience it, is a bit performative. I personally, when thinking about gender, psychological disorders, whatever, tend to use the biopsychosocial approach when talking about this stuff. The biopsychosocial approach tries to consider the biology, psychology, and social or cultural things going into ultimately what we're talking about. For gender, the biological components include what's going on with the person's genes, what chromosomes were they born with, as well as other factors that would influence their biological makeup. So it's been suggested that maybe hormonal things happen in utero that sort of shift a person's development, conforming or non-conforming with their chromosomal status. There's different things that happen in the biological process that can help contribute to what somebody identifies as. Also in biology is the brain. And there are tons of interesting studies looking at gender differences on brain things and bringing in like trans people, their differences, especially as they go through like hormone replacement therapy. Interesting stuff. I'm derailing. Second thing, psychology. So this is more the person's thoughts, feelings, emotions, stuff. So not necessarily the brain itself, but their psychological context for thinking about gender. I could completely derail this video, but let's save that for another day. Third is the cultural or the social aspects. And this is where the traditional gender roles really come into play. In the West, we have certain expectations for how men act and how women act, and these certainly are becoming less restrictive as we go on. Hopefully continues to just be whatever a person wants to be. Maybe get rid of labels. I don't know. We'll see. But basically, the culture does have a role in your expression of gender. So this is like what ContraPoints or Natalie Wynn is talking about with the performative nature of gender. It's a performance, and how you perform your gender is sort of not dictated, but the rules are sort of set in place by your culture, and how much you stick to or defy those rules is kind of on you. Okay, to sum up, Peterson is taking this paper's reported statistically significant but kind of small personality difference where women are more in negative self-affect, submissive, nurturing, and general more feeling-oriented than men, and saying that women are more protective, self-conscious, fearful, and nervous. No, bad Peterson. You're not helping my bias here on counseling psychologists. Don't misrepresent the research. Anyways, back on the Bible track, Eve is convinced by the snake to eat the apple because she's curious and wants to know more. So Eve eats the apple, she becomes conscious and self-conscious, gets Adam to eat the apple, and then he becomes conscious and, importantly to Peterson, self-conscious. Little has changed. Women have been making men self-conscious since the beginning of time. They do this primarily by rejecting them. But they also do it by shaming them, if men do not take responsibility. Since women bear the primary burden of reproduction, it's no wonder. It is very hard to see how it could be otherwise. But the capacity of women to shame men and render them self-conscious is still a primal force of nature. Yes, it is women as nature, as women, who have the power to make men feel self-conscious. And this power is granted to us by our monthly bleeding. And it is impossible for a man to make a woman feel self-conscious. Tell that to all the women who get rejected, and tell that to somebody I was friends with in middle school and high school who ended up going down a dark path after her ex-boyfriend made her feel fat. In other words, self-conscious. She ended up dying from complications of bulimia our junior year of high school. Make men take responsibility for what? Kids? Hopefully, he can see how guys with involuntary celibacy tendencies might take what he's saying here in a different way than men who've had more normal and healthy experiences with women. Squirrel! Snakes are important to see because they can be dangerous, especially to our little tree-dwelling ancestors. And Peterson brings up this idea that perhaps snakes being a threat to us is what helped us develop trichromacy. Trichromacy is our ability to see color based on 3 cone types. One that's good at like reddish light, one that's good at greenish light, and one that's good at bluish light. So those are maximum sensitivities. Really a topic for another day. Dogs and cats are dichromats with 2 cone types. So I personally have heard that it was more for being able to pick fruit that's ripe, since a red, ripe berry will stand out in the green foliage better for us than other types of mammals that are just running around with 2 cone types. But if life and higher ed has taught me anything, it's probably not either or. You know, it could be both. Okay, so this is going to be a long quote. Bear with me. The Peterson is strong in this one, but we'll go through the parts. This is perhaps one of the reasons the snake features in the Garden of Paradise as the creature who gives us the vision of God. This is perhaps one of the reasons why Mary, the eternal archetypal mother, Eve perfected, is so commonly shown in medieval and Renaissance iconography holding the Christ child in the air, as far away as possible from a predatory reptile which she has firmly pinned under her foot. And there's more. It's fruit that the snake offers, and fruit is also associated with the transformation of vision, in that our ability to see color is an adaptation that allows us to rapidly detect the ripe and therefore edible bounty of trees. As I mentioned in part 1, I had my husband read this chapter because I felt like I was missing something a good chunk of the time. And by this point, there was a lot of, it's just a fucking story from him. So we're in good times here. I sincerely doubt that the writers of the Old Testament were just beside themselves with how clever they were being, having the snake we evolved to be afraid of and helped shape our color vision to be the one who helped give us the fruit of vision. I imagine this could tie into the Jungian collective unconscious with the Old Testament writers accessing our ancestral memories of snakes and the significance of that and writing it in the story, and I don't know. Snakes are still a problem, even in Canada. I checked. The Bible is a group of stories, as some people like to point out, from the Bronze Age, that Renaissance artists would use ideas from the Bible isn't surprising. They were raised Christian. Again, we see the mother archetype. She just keeps popping up. Popular lady, our collective mom. Dear viewer, I am trying to paraphrase as much of this as I can so that you're not just having huge walls of text read to you, but this next part is so very Peterson. I have to show you in its raw form. Our primordial parents hearkened to the snake. They ate the fruit. Their eyes opened. They both awoke. You might think, as Eve did initially, that this would be a good thing. Sometimes, however, half a gift is worse than none. Adam and Eve wake up all right, but only enough to discover some terrible things. First, they notice that they're naked. It's only a story, Peterson. Adam and Eve weren't real people. There was no Eden. It's just a story. And now we're back to talking about naked people. Ooh, we're starting an aside. That's always a good sign for a section. So basically, I caught the reference here only because my dad mentioned it to me at some point. So I'm an old millennial, so I imagine that most millennials, this went flying right past their head, and even more so if you're younger. So let me explain. The Naked Ape is a 1967 book by Desmond Morris, who'd been a curator of the London Zoo. It tries to look at humans in the same way that other animals had been examined so far. There's a bit of just so storying in this book, with Morris speculating about why human penis size is like it is, or why women have breasts that stay their shape outside of nursing. And now you know a little bit about the Naked Ape. And of course, this book isn't referenced, even though he's taking the title from it. And yeah, now that you have another little piece of trivia to hopefully win pub trivia night, let's move on. We start this section with Peterson talking about his son's early modesty. By age 3, his son basically didn't want to be seen undressed by anyone, parents included, and Peterson says that it looked built in to me. Counter experience to Peterson's son, I, as a child, wasn't really into wearing clothes. I have several memories of being chased around the house by my mom, clothes in hand, like yelling at me, "You gotta get dressed, we're trying to go somewhere," and me just running away like, "No!"
Jacob, keep your shirt on! No!
I've seen plenty of kids in public out with their parents just start to disrobe, much to their parents' horror. I guess the Peterson apple doesn't fall far from the daddy tree. Let's talk about lice. So, we have 3 types of lice that tend to like us: head lice, body lice, and genital lice, also known as crabs. And these lice are very particular about where they live. Head lice will live in your hair and on your head. Body lice will be happiest under your clothing up against you. And genital lice like your bits and transmit that way. Did I get a friend? You wanna come here? Oh. Okay. Oh, so grunt. Player 2 wants to talk about lice. Hi. Let me get my legs up. Okay. I'm working. Some researchers in the early 2000s got the idea that we could probably get an idea of when people started wearing clothes if we looked at when body lice diverged from head lice. So, common ancestor, body lice like to be under clothing, so if we know when body lice kind of came on the scene, we should have an idea of when clothing showed up. Doing some always magical to me genetic analysis on these little lices, the initial researchers put clothing at about 72,000 years, give or take 42,000. So it's a bit of a time window, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that bad. Follow-up researchers put the time frame somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. We started wearing clothes. And I saw it speculated that this was in part as we started moving out of the area that we were adapted to, temperature-wise, we needed to start bundling up. And that's speculation, you can't really say for sure. However, this does mean that we weren't always wearing clothing. It's not like we just plunk, lost our fur, and then like, oh yeah, we need to wear clothes now because we're no longer furry. That's not how it happened. There was a period of time where people-ish were walking around naked and happy. And if you've watched any documentaries on some parts of the world, you'll know that clothing is not the default. To say it another way, wearing clothing isn't built in or instinctive like Peterson says it is. If anything, it's a learned trait or a learned behavior that we acquire in civilizations or cultures that demand it of us. So yeah, it feels weird to not wear clothes at this point, but it wasn't always the case. And certainly there's cultures where it's not the norm. Naked, of course, has a lot of symbology attached to it. Vulnerable, exposed, that type of stuff. So Adam and Eve felt ashamed when they realized they were naked with all of their faults hanging out. Peterson says that they dressed up to protect their egos and that they felt unworthy to stand before God. If you can't identify with that sentiment, you're just not thinking. Beauty shames the ugly. Strength shames the weak. Death shames the living. And the ideal shames us all. Thus, we fear it, resent it, even hate it. Pardon? I'd like to think I'm thinking, but I'm not really identifying with that statement. I mean, I'm not super pleased with my body, but I'd like to think I'm judged on more than just my physical shell. Is this because I don't believe in the Sky Daddy? Lines like that are why I had to have my husband read this chapter. Shame, shame, shame. Fear leads to resentment. Resentment leads to hate. And hate leads to the dark side. Is there going to be a Yoda moment in every rule? Total real talk time. If you saw my body dysmorphia video, you probably know that I'm not the biggest fan of how I look or of my body. But it's not shame that I feel, it's just I hate it. I hate how it looks, I hate how it feels. There's no external shame involved in this, just me. I don't feel shame, fear, resentment, hatred towards people I think are more attractive than me. I just don't like how I look. And I kind of feel like we're getting a little bit more of an autobiography of Peterson here than he might have intended. He asks what we should do about the Yoda cycle, and then puts forward the possibility that we abandon all ideals of beauty, health, brilliance, and strength. That's not a good solution. I don't want women who can stun by their mere presence to disappear, just so that others can feel unself-conscious. I don't want intellects to vanish. Thank God for Grace Kelly and Anita Ekberg and Monica Bellucci. I'm proud to feel unworthy in the presence of people like that. It's the price we all pay for aim, achievement, and ambition. But it's also no wonder that Adam and Eve covered themselves up. My notes in the margin for this paragraph start off with, why not challenge this? Meaning, why not challenge the ideals of strength or beauty? This is something that we could potentially change as a culture. And then it goes all the way to ugh when we get to talking about his preference in women. Autobiographical indeed. He's writing like the push for greater acceptance of different body types and a push for more than just book smarts is going to be the downfall of everything. Nobody is saying that he can't be attracted to who he's going to be attracted to, and that the people he thinks are smarter than him, he can still think they're smarter than him. Nobody is trying to take that away from him. Oh. When I go, oh, in a video, that means I have like a realization as I'm writing the script. So, oh. He has to keep this hierarchical. Beauty has to have a hierarchy. You can't have beauty without the prettiest lobster on top. I'm still not seeing why it's so obvious that Adam and Eve felt ashamed by their nakedness. Chemistry flashbacks are kicking in hard here. We continue with the Adam and Eve story finally, and Peterson kicks into overdrive. What does what Adam said to God mean? It means that people, unsettled by their vulnerability, eternally fear to tell the truth, to mediate between chaos and order, and to manifest their destiny. In other words, they are afraid to walk with God. That's not particularly admirable, perhaps, but it's understandable. God's a judgmental father. Is this what most people get out of this story? Like, is this something I'm missing out on because I didn't go to vacation Bible school as a kid? Because this feels like a huge reach to me. God questions Adam, Adam throws Eve under the bus, and yes, this is me condensing Peterson's condensing of the Bible with his commentary. Meta. How pathetic, and how accurate. The first woman made the first man self-conscious and resentful. Then the first man blamed the first woman, and then the first man blamed God. It's just a story. Peterson says that this is what any romantically rejected man goes through, where they feel small in front of the person who denigrated their reproductive capacity, and that they then blame God and being with a capital B before thinking about revenge. Bit of an escalation there, don't you think, Peterson? Back to Eden. God curses snakes with leglessness and being stomped by everything. And women, for their part, Eve, is cursed with painful childbirth and wanting a resentful man who will lord her biological fate over her permanently. Peterson takes this part as descriptive, basically that childbirth is a painful and not fun endeavor for women, and then not describing the other part. Now, I'm not a biblical scholar, but the King James Version that we have lying around says, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." Peterson gets a very different meaning from this than I do. To me, this is saying that women are going to be governed by the men in their lives, dad, husbands, whatever. And Peterson says that my interpretation is exactly wrong, and that what I'm saying is, God is a patriarchal tyrant, as politically motivated interpretations of the ancient story insist. He talks about the birthing process from an evolutionary perspective. So babies allow themselves to be born a year early, are completely dependent on their mother for a year, and then require training until they're 18. And all of this increases their dependence on their mom, which then increases the women's dependence on men. I'm on page 8 of the script already, and just no. Some parts, yes. Other parts, no. And that could actually just be my summary of this book. Stick it on the cover if you want. Some parts, yes. Other parts, no. God tells Adam that life is going to be hard, and then kicks the pair out of Eden, installs some holy bouncers with flaming swords to keep the riffraff out, and so that they can't get in and eat the immortality fruit. That, in particular, appears rather mean-spirited. Why not just make the poor humans immortal right away? Particularly if that is your plan for the ultimate future anyway, as the story goes. But who would dare to question God? Perhaps heaven is something you must build, and immortality is something you must earn. He doesn't elaborate on this last point further. Heaven as a concept that we build is touched on again, and we'll get to that eventually, but this immortality part, never seen again. We are finally getting back to the medication question from the beginning of the chapter. To save your memory, basically, why do people take better care of their pets than they do themselves? Peterson asks why anyone would take care of a descendant of Adam, given the riffraffness, and he does make it a point to include women in this statement here, so hey. So all the awful traits of Adam and Eve, like the lying and the bus throwing and the resentment and the shame, are why we don't like ourselves. And we especially don't like ourselves because we're privy to all of the bad thoughts and actions that we do, whereas for other people, we don't know what's going on inside their heads. And as such, a dog is more deserving of treatment than we are. Okay. But if you're not yet convinced, don't worry. The Genesis writers have got your back, fam. We're gonna be talking about your inevitable death and shit. Well, good, because I'm not convinced. So what does it mean for Adam and Eve to know good and evil? Peterson says it took him years to figure it out, and that it hinged on the nakedness. So predators, including cats and dogs, are hungry, not evil. He claims that they don't have the presence of mind, the creativity, and, above all, the self-consciousness necessary for the inspired cruelty of men. Unlike us, predators have no comprehension of their fundamental weakness, their fundamental vulnerability, their own subjugation to pain and death. And knowing our weaknesses means that we can exploit it in others. Maybe I've known some psychopathic cats in my time, but they're kind of capable of doing some messed up stuff. So I've known 2 cats to do what I'm going to talk about. Cat I had as a kid, Shara, and my current cat, Cleo, both avid out for crickets. And so when I was growing up, there were crickets everywhere. They would get into the house, and almost inevitably, they would find their way into the tub and just chirp away. And eventually they'd stop chirping. And they would stop chirping because my cat Shara would go into the tub, and I watched her do this once because it's like, what's going on? She'd go into the tub, get the cricket by one of its little jumpy legs, and then just start shaking. And eventually, the cricket would go flying off, and she'd still have the leg in her mouth. Spit out the leg, do it for the other jumpy leg. And there were times when the tub was just full of all these crickets that had no jumpy legs attached, surrounded by all these dismembered legs. And Cleo's done this too when there's crickets around, and they're not doing it for food because they just leave the crickets there. They could eat them, but they don't. They just leave them there to basically die, because the cricket can't survive without the little jumpy legs. It can't mate. It needs those little jumpy legs. And so there's me with a bunch of crickets who are doomed to death, now having to be the Grim Reaper that my cat refused to be. I haven't talked much about Nietzsche's influence on Peterson's work, largely because I haven't read Nietzsche, so it doesn't jump out at me like Jung does. But other members of his household have watched more interviews with Peterson, and Nietzsche does come up a fair bit. But while trying to find examples of animal violence other than my cats dissecting crickets, I stumbled across this piece on the Christian Science Monitor website of all places that said, Nietzsche characterizes humans as the cruelest of animals. So I guess if it's not Jung, I gotta be on the lookout for Nietzsche popping up, but I don't have the Nietzsche radar like I do Jung. So I guess I get to read Nietzsche now too. Briefly, animal violence. Chimpanzees will go to war with each other, and they are capable of doing some pretty terrifying and horrific shit to each other. Like the losing troop running up into the trees to get away from the assaulters, and babies either being left behind or falling and being eaten in front of the parents. It's fucked up. There's many instances of bottlenose dolphins going after other types of sea life, like porpoises, not because they're hungry or because it's impinging their territory or whatever, just for fun. I'm going to include the Tsavo man-eating lions of Kenya, who terrorized the railway workers for a period of time when they were trying to build the railways across Kenya. It's a pair of male lions who just started killing the railway workers. Maybe they were doing it for survival, but they were killing a lot of guys. More than they ate. And if this sounds familiar and you're a fan of Val Kilmer, you may have seen The Ghost in the Darkness, which was a movie based on this stuff. I mean, it's not 100% documentary, but it was a really good representation of it. And also, those lions are now on exhibit at the Chicago Field Museum, so if you're ever in the area, it's kind of cool. They look a little wonky, to say the least, like the initial stuffing wasn't the best. Are you leaving? Talking about stuffing kitties? Too much? All right. Here. So they're on display at the Chicago Field Museum if you are interested in seeing them, but the initial taxidermy work wasn't the best, and they've tried to do what they can to make it better, but they're not intimidating, let's say. And finally, there's the honey badger. You know, the honey badger is just gonna fuck shit up because it's a honey badger and that's how they do. Basically, it's not just humans who do this sort of thing. It's been a little bit since we've Petersoned. Let's fix that. Sharing is caring, after all. We can terrify other people consciously, hurt and humiliate, torture. That's far more than predation. That's a qualitative shift in understanding. That's a cataclysm as large as the development of self-consciousness itself. That's the entry of the knowledge of good and evil into the world. That's a second, as yet unhealed fracture in the structure of existence. That's the transformation of being itself into a moral endeavor, all attendant on the development of sophisticated self-consciousness. Don't the lobsters in their little lobster dominance dance try to humiliate or terrify or hurt the other lobsters? Are we ignoring that now because it's convenient to? Okay, so needing to remind myself about what Peterson has said so far about being. In the overture, being was characterized as an immaterial thing that is tied to personal and collective experience and shaped by our choices. The burden of being is the knowledge that life is hard. Rule 1, standing up straight with your shoulders back, means to shoulder the burden of being. Transforming being into a moral endeavor. Does that just mean living a good life? Like not mean or cruel to other people? Maybe? Peterson says that only man will inflict suffering for the sake of suffering. That's his working definition of evil, and that animals can't manage that. So many mangled crickets. And with the realization we can really hurt each other, we have well-nigh full legitimization of the idea, very unpopular in modern intellectual circles, of original sin. I'm not a biblical scholar, but isn't original sin just the eating of the knowledge fruit? Now, I could see Peterson tying that into the knowledge of good and evil, and then that hurting each other, but the reason this isn't popular in modern intellectual circles is it was a story. The Bible is a collection of stories. That didn't really happen for a good chunk. How does knowing that we can hurt each other legitimize original sin? Again, I'm not following here. Who can deny the sense of existential guilt that pervades human experience? And who could avoid noting that without that guilt, that sense of inbuilt corruption and capacity for wrongdoing, a man is one step from psychopathy? In addition to not being a biblical scholar, I am also not a philosopher. So please forgive me if my definition of existential guilt is a little bit weak. Best I can figure, existential guilt is a guilt that you feel that you haven't lived your life to its fullest potential. So it seems like he's talking more about original sin here than existential guilt. And as he said, original sin isn't popular to talk about in modern intellectual circles, so I could see trying to dress it up as something else. And then there's the always cheerful thought for us atheists, where how many people are kept from doing horrible things because a sky daddy told them not to? Human beings have a great capacity for wrongdoing. It's an attribute that is unique in the world of life. I'd make a smash cut of animals being shitty to each other, but I imagine to get through that project, I would need an industrial level of brain bleach and a bunch of sedatives, so we're just not going to do that. However, I will refer you to remember the sexy shenanigans from Rule 1 and the examples of animal violence from a little bit ago. Peterson argues that, given how awful we are, it's no surprise that we wouldn't want to take care of humans, ourselves or otherwise. Who then could be faced with illness, in himself or another, without doubting the moral utility of prescribing a healing treatment? What? My mom got a cancer diagnosis in April, and there was no doubt in my mind about her pursuing whatever treatments she could. None. Especially about something like the moral utility of the treatment. What? How are his kids not dead? I can make room for ethics if we're talking about quality versus quantity of life. Unfortunately, my husband and I, at the beginning of the year, had to have this discussion about our other cat. So our other cat, around December, her kidneys decided to say, fuck life. And yeah, so we got her tested, got her started on treatment, and with moving here, our life was crazy. And she was absolutely my husband's cat, and he was really busy with work. And so I don't know how much of her weird behavior was the kidneys and how much was her just sulking that my husband wasn't home. So she kind of stopped eating like the day before we left where we were living. And it was a several-day drive to where we are now. And on that drive, she didn't eat. She stopped drinking. So our first day here in the new place, I was at the vet with her, and my husband was finishing up with the movers, and they ran some tests, gave her some fluids, and told us that next day we'll have answers. Next day, get a call, and the next morning, the vet tells us that we have a couple options. Her kidneys are basically non-functional, but maybe there's something that could be done. She could be taken to the vet, like a special vet clinic, where she'd be on fluids 24 hours a day, try to get them working again, maybe. Or she had really not been her full self for some time, like some months prior to this. And we started the treatments, and it helped some, but it might have just been too late. And so we had a talk about what's best for her. She was 17. We got her probably when she was about 1 at an adopt-a-thon. So I don't know what her life was like before that, but hopefully she had a good life with us. There was no discussion about the moral utility of whatever. Like, we talked about if she would be able to bounce back from this. And it really didn't seem like she'd be able to. And we basically came down on the decision that if we went with the really intense treatment, we might buy her some time, so some quantity of life, but at the expense of quality. Since we're here, dear viewer, talking about animals and their experiences and stuff, let me share a talk I went to once. So this talk was by a bioethicist, so a philosophy guy who specialized in biology and ethics, and he helped write a lot of the standards for ethical research in animals, and I was lucky enough to see him give a talk once. The thing from his talk, or I think it might have been questions after, that stuck with me is that animals have a sense of a now. Like, they've put it together from research that animals have a now. They understand current experience of stuff. Some animals have a memory or a past. They can remember people they've interacted with, places they've been, food that's good. They have a history. But we don't really have evidence that they're good at understanding the future, the later on. Like, they can kind of plan, but it's not really dealing with the future in an abstract way like we can. And so he was saying that one of the things to keep in mind when we're doing like experiments on animals or we're doing treatment, animals going through something like chemo, they have a now. And in that now is pain and discomfort. And in the animal's understanding, that might be the rest of their life. We can't communicate to them that this is just temporary. We're doing this to help them, to make them better. Like, we can't convey that to them. So if you have a kid with cancer, you can convey to them, like, it's gonna suck now, but you're going to have a hopefully healthy life after this. Or if you have a parent with cancer, hopefully they understand that the chemo is temporary. The discomfort and the pain is temporary. It's to make them better. Animals don't understand that. And so with treating animals with like chemo or kidney disease, at some point, there is a trade-off in the discomfort and pain now to build them and buy them later on. So the thing that stuck with me 10 plus years later is personal decisions on this. I need to know that if I'm going to subject an animal to awfulness now, I need to know that they're going to have a later on that this is worth it for. I need to know that I can fill their life with good things and not just have it end in this awfulness if I have the chance. And that's kind of where we were with our cat. It didn't seem like she had much of a later on to justify going through something that may or may not have bought her time because her kidneys were done. That's all. Back to Peterson. Maybe some puppies and kitties in between. He ends this section by saying, maybe man was a mistake. The world would be better off without us. So, what do we do? I haven't really mentioned Peterson's emphasis on Genesis 1 being about the power of the word, and Genesis 2 and on being about the fall of man. It's come up several times, but only now is it really becoming relevant. But he does reemphasize that in Genesis 1, the power of the word is to separate order from chaos. The moral of Genesis 1 is that being brought into existence through true speech is good. This is true even of man himself prior to his separation from God. This goodness is terribly disrupted by the events after the fall, but we retain an intimation of the prelapsarian state. We remember, so to speak. We remain eternally nostalgic for the innocence of childhood, the divine, unconscious being of the animal, and the untouched cathedral-like old-growth forest. We worship them, even if we are self-proclaimed atheistic environmentalists of the most anti-human sort. But we are no longer one with God and nature, and there is no simple turning back. I'm kind of tempted, when I'm done with this read-through of this book, to go back through for all these instances of so to speak, or as they say, or variants therein, and see if they are attached to religious things or Jungian things. I kind of have a hunch that they are. This we remember, so to speak, kind of is hinting of the collective unconscious ancestral memory thing again. Speaking about the conscious or the unconscious state of animals has always been weird to me. I've basically always been around cats my entire life, in varying numbers, and I can say with certainty that they respond to stimuli in differing ways. What I mean by that is basically they have personalities. Some are aloof and standoffish, and you really have to work to earn their trust and get any affection from them. Others are like little black furry shadows that follow you around everywhere and live for cuddles. My point with this is that I find it hard to believe that all animals have no conscious experience of the world. My cat's snoring. Great. So, yeah, like they may not be able to grapple with being with a capital B like we can, but that doesn't mean that they don't have their own little furry version of consciousness. And it's not even just mammals. Birds are hella smart, and they have personalities. Reptiles. Reptile owners are more than happy to tell you about the little scaly exploits that their friends have gotten into. It's not just us who have a subjective experience of reality. I can't say I find myself wishing I wasn't conscious like the animals. If anything, I jealously cling to my conscious experience and am not looking forward to the day it inevitably goes away. I guess recycling is now an act of obeisance to environment with a capital E. Are we not allowed to just enjoy nature without it becoming like some religious experience? What did he say? Self-proclaimed atheistic environmentalists. Ugh. Earlier, he was almost teasing Adam and Eve for their lacking a consciousness about themselves, but now he's longing for that state. He continues to say that Adam and Eve, in their pure state, pre-apple, or pomegranate, or whatever fruit, were good. That was their default state. They were just good. They didn't have free will or problem solving or consciousness really, but they were good. And he goes on to say maybe goodness that is earned is better than goodness that you just have. Perhaps it is not simply the emergence of self-consciousness and the rise of our moral knowledge of death and the fall that besets us and makes us doubt our own self-worth. Perhaps it is instead our unwillingness, reflected in Adam's shamed hiding to walk with God, despite our fragility and propensity for evil. What does the moral knowledge of death even mean? Is this the humans are sadistic, animals are incapable of it thing from earlier? Stop being flowery and vague, Peterson. Moral knowledge of the fall. First, again, the Bible is just a story. Second, had I been born in a different country or a different time period, I might not have knowledge about the fall. And yeah, there are creation stories around the world that do have some concept of people being in a perfect utopic sort of place and then ending up in the current world. And stories about that, I think, are more just explanations of why life is hard and why we're here, and not necessarily trying to represent our descent from divine consciousness or something. Again, with the doubting of self-worth. I mean, I guess with his target demo for this book, hammering that point really makes sense, because if you're reading this type of book, unless you're just a masochist like me, you're probably looking for answers on how to improve your life, and so you probably are doubting your self-worth. So I guess marketing, it makes sense. And maybe on some level, having some self-doubt is a good thing. Kind of keeps the overconfidence in check. If you think you're hot shit at rocket surgery and you show up to do it and nobody questions your credentials, it might blow up in your face. So I guess what I'm coming back to here is this idea of balance, where you need to have some confidence in what you can do, but also accept what you can't do. And you can work on that and try to become better, and also not become cocky with the things that you know. And I wouldn't be surprised if Peterson would take what I just said as walking with God. Peterson says that the Bible's flow is such that everything after the fall, including the New Testament, is supposed to represent a way out of evil. I thought a huge chunk of the Old Testament was kind of an exaggerated history of the Israelites. But I'm not a biblical scholar, so what do I know? So he says the thing to fix our alleged shame and self-worth issue is to embody the image of God, to speak out of chaos the being that is good, but to do so consciously, of our own free choice. We can't take care of ourselves properly because we are fallen creatures, but maybe if we lived in truth, with a capital T, we could respect ourselves again. And if we can respect ourselves, maybe we can care for ourselves and other people and work on building heaven on earth instead of focusing on our resentment and anger at others and building a hell on earth. This seems like a nice place to end the chapter, but nope, still going. So Peterson says that the area that Christianity grew up in was more barbaric than it is today, and that the primary moral concern then was the control of violent, impulsive selfishness and the mindless greed and brutality that accompanies it. And he says that people now, with those tendencies or urges, either have more social barriers in the way of doing it, or they try to control it because it's not socially acceptable. Trump was president when this was published, right? Yep. Okay. The issue for Peterson now is that people will work to reduce the suffering of other people, but not for themselves. A citation, anytime he said this, would be super helpful, but alas, life is hard. He argues that we are getting the message of Jesus' crucifixion wrong. Christ's archetypal death exists as an example of how to accept finitude, betrayal, and tyranny heroically. How to walk with God despite the tragedy of self-conscious knowledge, and not as a directive to victimize ourselves in the service of others. To sacrifice ourselves to God, to the highest good if you like, does not mean to suffer silently and willingly when some person or organization demands more from us. consistently than is offered in return. That means we are supporting tyranny and allowing ourselves to be treated like slaves. It is not virtuous to be victimized by a bully, even if that bully is oneself. Aha! Archetypes. Again. Archetypes. Jung. Coming again. Yeah. Something I don't think I've really called attention to is how much victims and victimization comes up as this horrible thing for Peterson. And I think it might be just above the nihilistic death march in terms of not good states to be in. So are we supposed to sacrifice ourselves for the greater good, but only when it's fair? And again with the bullying. Like, is every rule going to incorporate bullies somehow? Were you bullied as a kid, Dr. P? 2 lessons Peterson said he learned from Jung is that 1, folksy life advice like the golden rule, love your neighbor like you love yourself, these sorts of things, those say nothing about having to be nice in them. And 2, these sorts of statements should be not taken as descriptive necessarily, but more as equations. Transactional, you might say. He says that everyone is obligated to bargain aggressively for their own self-interests, and that if you don't do so, with friends or other relationships, you're not being a good citizen or a good friend, and you'll end up a slave. I really dislike when people start thinking about interactions with people as transactional. It kind of makes it lose any sense of being genuine. It's just, well, who are you and what can you do for me? Although maybe this is why I suck at networking. The next part is a trip. Peterson says that you are not allowed to mistreat yourself because ultimately you are not yours to mistreat. On the secular end, he says that mistreating yourself hurts those around you. Can't disagree here. It's one of the shitty parts of being in a depressive spiral. You're feeling bad about yourself and how your existence is impacting those around you. And yeah, like, you may be hurting your friends and family by being in that depressed state, and knowledge of that can push you further into the depressed state, and down you go. And then he says, but, metaphorically speaking, there is also this. You have a spark of the divine in you, which belongs not to you, but to God. Right. First, recall Jung's theory of development, where the final stage is the spirit stage, where people gain access to or remember that they are divine beings, spiritual beings in nature, and the concerns and drives of the world sort of fall away. And that this stage is supposed to be a stage that we all strive to achieve. And that's not necessarily what he's talking about here, but I do feel like it's still relevant. Second, personally speaking, this is one of the worst things I can hear when I'm in that mindset. Oh honey, don't do that. God would hate if you threw away his precious gift like that. Almost makes me want to do it out of spite. Kidding. But even the secular version of that, of, oh, don't do it, you'll hurt all those around you, like, it's not helpful. Depressed brain is very good at coming up with reasons of like, yeah, it'll hurt them now, but they'll get over it eventually, or they'll realize they're better off without me, or whatever. Like, it's not a helpful argument. When Peterson is feeling depressed, he says that he tries to look around and see the good that people are doing, the empathy they can show for each other, the kindness that they can do in their acts or what they say, and that this helps him. Especially for people who are inadequate or ugly, really warms the heart. And he says that he gives this advice to clients who are feeling down, especially for how they interact with others, and also a little kindness for themselves. Squirrel! Peterson says that he's surprised that people can function at all with how tortured by the limitations and constraint of being we all are. Did you know, dear viewer, that we have central heat and running water and infinite computational power and electricity and enough for everyone to eat? So Payne's scale, definition of thing, and now I guess the existence of homeless people and the fact that some kids basically derive all of their nutrition from school lunch programs. This is going to be an awkward conversation. Humanity has it harder than animals ever do because of the subjugation to mortal vulnerability, tyranny of the state, and the depredations of nature. Hatred for self and mankind must be balanced with gratefulness for tradition and the state, and astonishment at what normal, everyday people can accomplish. Did I accidentally change the channel to the North Korean news network translated into English accidentally when I wasn't paying attention? Nope. Still a book. Weird. Everyone deserves respect, even though everyone is deeply flawed. Time to shit on parents again. To rule 2 yourself, you need to do what's best for you ultimately instead of what just makes you happy. And parents who do this are harming their children. While yeah, shoving candy into your kid's cry hole to get them to stop crying isn't the best long-term solution, let the kids live a little. Earlier, he asked if you want your kids safe or strong. I'm gonna test that a little. In this section, he's talking about making sure that your kids wear their snowsuit before going out and playing in the snow, brushing their teeth before bed, that sort of thing. But one of the best ways to teach kids a lesson is to let them learn on their own. Little Timmy doesn't want to wear a snowsuit to go play in the snow? Okay, fine. We'll bring it just in case, but you do you, Timmy. You know you best. Plays in the snow for a little bit, gets a bit cold, maybe even holds out a little out of pride. That was me as a kid. But eventually Timmy comes back and like, can I have my snowsuit? Oh, you want your snowsuit? Are you cold? All right, here you go, dumbass. Did you learn? Good. Do you want your kids safe or smart? He says it's important to plan for the future so you can start making changes in your life and what you're doing in order to achieve that goal. Cool. But then he says, you need to know where you're going so that you can limit the extent of chaos in your life, restructure order, and bring the divine force of hope to bear on the world. Some more of stand up for yourself and do what's best for you, not what makes you happy necessarily, along with some be a good person. And then we mix it up a little bit with a quote from Nietzsche that says, he whose life has a why can bear almost any how. You can give your life meaning with a capital M by aiming to not go to your own personal living hell. That would justify your miserable existence. That would atone for your sinful nature and replace your shame and self-consciousness with the natural pride and forthright confidence of someone who has learned once again to walk with God in the garden. So, my husband isn't one to get offended easily. But he was offended at the tone that Peterson was taking with this chapter, especially for people essentially coming to him for help, that we're flawed and we're awful and we're wicked and all of these things. Just, And this kind of reminds me of one of the dark pillars of a lot of the world's religions, that we are flawed. We have a hole in us that can only be filled by God. We're wretched, sinful creatures by our nature, and only through whatever the religion says can we be made whole or good or whatever. Have you considered tithing? As I've mentioned repeatedly, I wasn't really making a great connection with what Peterson was talking about for most of this chapter. His repeated, if you're paying attention, this will make sense, and my continual, nope, swore I was paying attention, but it's not making sense, really built in this sense that I was missing the bottom actual point of what he was talking about here. To touch on the things from the beginning of this video and to bring in the part 2 to hopefully wrap this all up in a nice, neat package with a pretty bow. First, people apparently love their pets more than they love themselves because of our innate, sinful, wretched nature. 2, I still don't know for sure what the fundamental assumptions we needed to understand for Genesis were. 3, the fundamental elements of subjective experience of chaos, order, and consciousness didn't make an appearance again. So, fourth, the personalities of order and chaos didn't overtly make a reappearance in the second part. I mean, maybe God was order and the snake was chaos. No. Eden is absolute order and snake is chaos getting into the garden of absolute order. The whole bit about personalities and our evolution to them. Fifth, the biological sex category that's so deeply ingrained in our cognition and perception that we spent so much time on was not brought up in Adam and Eve. Glad we spent so much time there. 6, women as nature not only hurt men's feelings, but took an agent of chaos's word under advisement, got us kicked out of Order Central, and here we are, if certain stories are to be believed. 7, the sex categories may be the way, but if you're going to be content in this life, you need to work past your wicked awfulness. 8, middle of this rule may have emphasized having a balance of order and chaos to keep us sharp and smart and attentive. But by the end of the rule, we're back into order as our camp and chaos being kept at arm's length. Finally, this rule mentioned transforming being into a moral endeavor. I think that ties into the stuff later on in the chapter where he's talking about the kindness and empathy that people are capable of. Something I'm going to try to do in wrapping up these videos is offer alternatives to Peterson's lessons that you're supposed to take from these rules. First off, instead of focusing on our sin and our awfulness and our wretched nature, how about instead, nobody's perfect, and that's okay. We all have flaws. We all have things that could be better. Some of these things we can improve on. We can work on our work ethic. We can work on our ability to speak another language. These are things that we can improve on. Other things that may be flaws are things that we can't really improve on, and so we need to learn to embrace and to love even. So an example of this is I've got this ear flap. So, see, flap. Don't have it on this side. I was obviously born with it, and surgery is an option, but I've kind of embraced it. It's unique, makes me different, and if anything, I've gotten called a fairy or an elf a couple times, especially given my height, and that's kind of fun. So, learn to love your flap. Second, instead of caring for yourself as you would if you were caring for somebody else, how about caring for yourself as somebody who cares for you would? This can be an incredibly hard thing to do. I'm speaking from experience, and I can only imagine being able to care for yourself as people who love you and care for you do would be like just a mental state of like the biggest, best hug. Finally, to quote the comedian Patton Oswalt with an unrelated but very relevant quote, "Life is chaos, be kind." All right, so I think that's a good place to leave the video with the warm fuzzies for everyone, hopefully. Channel stuff. Subscribe if this was interesting. If you want to know the second my videos come out, ring the alarm bell. I totally understand if you don't ring the bell, the little notifications drive me crazy. I get it. But hey, subscribe. Like if you enjoyed. Ask questions, or if you have comments or corrections, you can put them in the comments or on Twitter. We've also been having a fair amount of fun on Discord, so link will be in the description for that. You can support this channel and what I'm doing on Patreon. I'm getting close to having a live stream with the patrons, so maybe that'll be soon. And yeah, next week, not Peterson. Maybe you're looking forward to it as much as I am. All right, see you guys in the next video.